Hello, Rob. We're back with more ghost stories. This one is from Spooks Deluxe. I've actually ordered a new copy of this with the original dust jacket from 1956, as told and recounted by Danton Walker. Some excursions into the supernatural. The Franklin Watts Incorporated book, as you can see, 1956. From ghoulies and ghosties and long-legged beasties and things that go bump in the night, King Lord deliver us. Scottish. Anonymous. The story I'm going to read is Dorothy Massey's story. Since the last ghost story I had, I read fumbly, apparently, since somebody complained about it. I'm not a professional reader. I don't try to be either. And I hold this camera over the damn book like a champion for 10, 20 minutes at a time. And I deliver a story no one else is going to give to you. Anyway, Dorothy Massey's story. Animals figure frequently in stories of haunted houses or bewitched persons, more especially dogs and cats. It is traditional that a rat will desert a ship that is headed for disaster. But I never knew that a mouse also gets the message until Mrs. Raymond Massey told me of her experiences, which might be labeled the Massey's migrating mice. The exact street addresses and correct names of the people involved can't be given. Unfortunately, due to certain laws of libel which are intended to protect property values or the reputations of individuals. However, I personally knew several of the people involved. And New York newspaper morgues contain clippings of the incidents mentioned in this story. Back in the 1940s, the Raymond Masseys, wary of camping out in hotels in New York or California, where Ray's movie commitments frequently took him, decided to purchase a townhouse in New York as a pied-à-terre. I don't know what the hell that word is. That eventually could call home. They could eventually call home. After the usual search, they hit on a block in the East 80s, which contained a number of charming old brownstone mansions, by now something of a drug on the market because of their size and the prevalent servant problem. The house they eventually acquired wasn't the first one that struck Mrs. Massey's fancy. The one they first looked at across the street was, in her opinion, more attractive and a better buy, but Ray didn't like it and said he felt he wouldn't feel comfortable there. At that time, Dorothy explains, no one could have felt comfortable in any of them. It was February, and all the houses were cold, with that penetrating cold one meets in long vacant dwellings. But that one house, the one Ray didn't like, had a chill that was not of this earth. He said it felt to him more like a tomb. Dorothy, being accustomed to actors' hunches and respecting them, didn't insist. The house they did settle on was, after a complete restoration job, completely charming, and Mrs. Massey was reconciled to the choice. She thought no more about the house across the way until a series of curious and inexplicable incidents again brought it to her attention. While out walking her dog one morning, she encountered a lady who was also giving her pooch an airing. As usually happens when dog fanciers meet, they struck up a conversation, and Dorothy learned that the stranger was her neighbor, living across the street in the house that Ray hadn't liked. "We looked at your house before we bought ours," Mrs. Massey remarked. "I thought it was more attractive than the one we did buy, but my husband didn't like it for some reason or other, and I didn't argue with him." "It is an attractive house," the lady answered, "but there's one thing about it that bothers me. We have mice. We have tried practically everything to get rid of them, but they just refuse to get out. They seem to be even more attached to the place than we are." It was some time after this casual meeting that Mrs. Massey, glancing out of the front window of their second-story library, noticed a peculiar movement going on across the way. From the English basement of the house that Ray hadn't liked, there was a sudden exodus of mice. They came out in groups in a panicky sort of way, confused and scurrying along the gutter. Then one or two got brave and made the bold dash across the street to my house. I immediately ran to the phone to call the exterminator. I didn't see if or how they got in, Dorothy went on. But get in, they certainly did. All of a sudden, we had plenty of mice. We tried poison and traps and just about everything else you can think of, but got no results until the plumber brought around a couple of cats. They're still the best mousetraps, but that's not the point of the story. A few days after the mice started coming in, Ray called my attention to a front page story in one of the morning papers. A Mrs. B, described as socially prominent and well-to-do, had committed suicide. Why, I exclaimed, that must be the woman who lives across the street. Check the address. Ray did, and sure enough, it was the house across the way. The house from which the mice had moved out the week before. After the woman's death, the rest of her family moved away and the place was put on the market. I don't remember just when it was taken over again, but it was pretty apparent why it was taken over. The new occupant was a gorgeous blonde, a former Follies beauty, who was being installed by a wealthy playboy, the nationally known executive of a big oil company. You, of course, recognize his name. He was always getting married or divorced or something, and his extramarital affairs invariably got mentioned in the gossip columns. When he died of natural causes, I hope. There was a big battle over his estate. As might be expected, his first wife got most of the money, and his gal friends had to be content with the furs and jewels and other finery that he had given them while he was still alive. The blonde living across the way was dispossessed, literally put out on the sidewalk, gilded Dubarry bed and all. But again, that is not the point of this story. Just before his death made front page news, those darned mice moved out again. I happened to be standing at the front window, minding my own business, adjusting a Venetian blind, as I remember, when I saw it happen. And again, I had to go through the routine of seeing that the mice didn't take up permanent residence in my house. This mouse Hagera was beginning to get on my nerves, and I found myself watching the house across the way for further manifestations, almost as a morning ritual. However, nothing happened again for a long time. After remaining vacant a while, the house found another purchaser. Neither Ray nor I knew anything about our new neighbor, but we heard through the local grapevine that he was a solid, successful businessman, and we thought no more about it. And then one day it happened again, the mouse migration, I was watering some plants in the window box when I saw the little creatures going through the same rigmarole, and I went cold all over. What was going to happen now? I kept nervously anticipating some sort of bad news from across the way. And I didn't have to wait long to get it. While Ray and I were having breakfast, he called my attention to an item on the front page of the New York Times. A prominent businessman who flew his own private plane and was returning, as I recall it, from some trip to Canada, had cracked up over the Hudson and drowned before rescuers could reach him. Neither of us knew the man, but we both instantly recognized his home address. The house across the way. And then the most extraordinary thing happened. The mice that were in my basement, we hadn't got rid of them all, in spite of traps, cats, and every other precaution, now started moving out. I kept a careful watch on them and discovered that they were leaving my basement and going back across the street, where they had originally come from. Mrs. Massey, who has a delightful sense of humor, especially for one trained in the legal profession, as she was, laughed. No, nothing particularly sinister happened to us after the mice moved out, except that our furnace blew up. Nobody was hurt, and we were fully protected by insurance, so I suppose there's no angle to the story there. It didn't blow up your house? Sometime after that, Ray and I fell in love with a place in Connecticut that had belonged to the Larry Tibbetts and decided to move there and sell our townhouse in the 80s. In connection with transferring the property, I took occasion to delve into the history of some of the houses in our block. I then learned that the house across the way, which seemed to be connected with bad luck of one kind or another, had been built by a distinguished lawyer a partner in one of the most prominent legal firms in the country. He apparently didn't live there very long, and it was after he had left the place that he attempted suicide. He had gone into Presbyterian Hospital for some physical checkups and, for reasons never explained, escaped from the attendants and run down to the Hudson where he tried to drown himself. They fished him out of the river in fair shape, and he continued to live a long time after that, but he never explained why he had made the try. I don't know what the house across the way had to do with it, if anything, Mrs. Massey concluded. But looking back, it is a bit disturbing, isn't it? Goodbye, bruv.